What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Murder Unscripted, the podcast that aims to immerse you in the true crime genre like never before. I'm Ed Hydock, and with my co-host, Melissa Spivey.
Hey!
So, we have been teasing this for a couple weeks now. We finished up our block on Bundy with an awesome interview with Edna Cal Martin, and then we moved on to John Wayne Gacy last week and kind of told you some really disturbing facts about, man, one of America's most notorious killers, the world's most notorious killers. What a sicko.
And probably ruined all of your days, because Gacy managed to ruin my, last couple weeks.
It's true. It's sad to talk about, but today we have a super special guest, Dr. Jeffrey Smalldon, who is a retired forensic psychologist and author. He just put out a book, The Beast Was Not Me, right here.
Woo!
I'll get our copies. So he is going to have some insight on Gacy and a bunch of other stuff that we're going to get into. And here he is, Dr. Jeffrey Smalldon.
Hi, Ed and Melissa. Good to be with you.
Hi!
Great to have you. Thank you so much, sir. I appreciate you joining us.
I'm glad to be here.
So before we get into your backstory and kind of how you got here, I want to start by asking you about the title of your book, That Beast Was Not Me. Where did that title come from? And why did you deem it worthy of a book cover?
Well, it's a quote from the first proper letter that Charles Manson ever wrote me in March of 1975 when I was still an undergraduate student. And I chose it for two reasons. One, Manson was protesting against the public perception of him as this one-dimensional monster, as if he didn't contribute to the creation of that persona. But he was protesting against it and saying, that's not who I am. And I found over my years of working with a wide variety of killers, particularly some of these notorious repeat killers, that's a very consistent theme of theirs. They're very resistant to attempts by anyone else to put them in a box, in any way minimize them. They see themselves as a world. So they don't like being minimized or put in a box. So, Gacy would frequently say to me, I know you're expecting the monster, but now you're going to meet the man. That's how he talked about himself. And it's sort of I think a kindred quote to Manson's, that beast was not me. I'm more complicated than that. So I chose it for that reason. And a second reason is that one of the themes, I think, that runs throughout my book is the difficulty sometimes of drawing bold lines between killers and the rest of us. And I cite any number of things in my book. For example, the woman who is marketing on one of the murderabilia websites baggies of dirt,
Yes,
allegedly drawn from Gacy's crawl space. And you think, who would do that? That's bizarre. And who would buy them and believe that they came from the crawl space? But there are many instances cited throughout my book of ostensibly normal people acting not, in some ways, not so different from people who commit murder. And I identify myself as one of those, in particular in an anecdote that appears in the chapter devoted to my work as the defense expert on the case of notorious Ohio serial killer Thomas Lee Dillon, where I found myself hoping for my opportunity to appear on 60 Minutes, even though I knew that if my hope was fulfilled, there was a possibility that the killers, then known as the DC snipers, would kill again, which they did.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to ask myself, wait a minute, you were actually willing to set the stage basically for the murder of more victims by this person or persons who was the DC sniper so that you could be on 60 Minutes.
Unreal.
And I had to grapple with what that said about me.
I have a fun DC sniper story. So that is around the time that I had started on Forensic Files, and we would do, this was in Allentown, Pennsylvania. So not in Hollywood, not in New York City. So we were in this little town, and they hadn't caught the guy yet. So we were doing a story and a recreation. We would always recreate the crimes or what we think happened based on the evidence. So we had a car in our parking lot with a license plate that flipped down and a little hole drilled so they could stick the gun out, just like the snipers did at one point. And
Yeah.
cops swarm the office because they thought they found the sniper's car. And because we get a replica, so that was my
Because
first
they thought
experience.
they had found the real car.
Yes.
Oh, wow. Well, in my case, it was the morning. Well, I was hoping to appear on this episode of 60 Minutes. I've been watching that show since I was a kid, and I thought that'll be cool to be on 60 Minutes. But when we were taping the episode with Scott Pelley doing the interview, they thought that maybe they had caught the snipers that morning. They had detained two guys who turned out not to be the snipers. But during his interview with me, Pelley was called out into the hallway, and I overheard him speaking in hushed whispers. And that's when I was thinking, man, I hope those guys aren't the real snipers, because if they are, this story will immediately get quashed. It'll mean nothing, and it won't appear on Wednesday night. Yeah, but I had to grapple with what in the world that said about me.
Yeah.
So, anyway.
So why now? What was your motivation now after all these years? 50 years in the business, long time.
Well, a lot of those early years were a decade before I became a forensic psychologist, which I think is one of the interesting elements of my long story. But for years, I'd been thinking of writing a book. I knew for sure that I had accumulated a lot of uncommon experiences. And I felt sure that if I could write about them in an engaging way, there would be other people interested in them. I didn't know if I could write about them in an engaging way. I'd never written anything like this before, but I was willing to take the chance. And then the pandemic came along, and that gave me the excuse I needed to sit down and really concentrate on it. And that's when the book came into being.
Great. Well, regardless, it's a long time that you've been doing this, and it all started somewhere. So I want to talk about your upbringing a little bit. I know your dad was an FBI agent, so you probably moved around quite a bit. Yeah.
We moved around a lot. Those were in the days when FBI agents got moved every year or two. I still remember my mom kind of slumping and sighing when my dad would arrive home from work and say, "I've been transferred again." Right after we'd just gotten a house built or, gotten settled in an area. So yeah, we moved a lot. I think I lived 8 places before we finally settled in Western New York, right before my 4th grade year. So I often had the experience of feeling like an outsider in a new place, particularly when we moved to Washington, D.C. A lot of my classmates were embassy kids. I'd never even been around kids from other countries before. So it was disorienting to me, and I sort of had trouble getting my legs there. But yeah, I mean, I think that early on that caused me to develop a sympathy for the outsider's point of view, or at least an interest in it.
Very good.
Do you feel like your dad's career shaped your passion? Like, did it make you want to learn more about criminology? And
It did. It did. My dad had a very different perspective than I did. I was pleased that he lived long enough until 1998. I first began practicing in 1990 to be aware of the work that I was doing on death penalty cases and to feel proud of me, I think, even though, he didn't have much sympathy for the defendants in criminal cases. And he always hated his experience of being an expert witness in court and have defense attorneys badgering him when he was on the witness stand. So he had a very different perspective from mine, but he was interested in it. He never said, why would you be working with these murderers, Jeff? Or why are you being hired by defense attorneys on these death penalty cases? So in that way, he affected me. But the more important way is that I think talk of crime and criminality were always a low hum in our household. And I was aware of it when he would arrive home from lunch with a shoulder pistol. Uh, and I took note of that. And, his big beat for a long time was the mafia beat in Niagara Falls, in particular,
Wow.
Stefano Magaddino, who was the big Western New York Don. And I remember, I'm sure, he would have gotten a letter of censure from the FBI had they known that he did this. But he was part of a revolving cast of people who were assigned to do surveillance outside Magaddino's house. It was a weekend. And he said, I was with him in the car, and he said, Jeff, just, lay down on the back floor. I've got to be outside Magaddino's house for an hour, but just lay down on the back floor. So,
Wow.
so I
Wow.
did. And there was the
Whoa.
place where all the mafiosos ate dinner in Niagara Falls was called the Como. It was an Italian restaurant. And this is another thing that sticks in my mind. My dad would occasionally take our whole family to the Como because he really liked it. And as we were leaving the Como after dinner that night, a guy coming in the door said, "Hey, Jack, how you doing?" My dad said, "Hi, Peter, how are you?" We got outside, and I said, "Who is that?" And he says, "Peter Magaddino." And I said, "Peter Magaddino?" And they were so friendly. Like they knew one another. Magaddino knew my dad, was on his trail all the time. Yet they greeted one another going in and out the restaurant. And I thought, well, that's interesting. So these guys who are alleged to be involved in all these murders, they owned a funeral parlor in Niagara Falls of all things.
Ooh.
Could be that friendly with my dad and look and act totally normally.
Yeah.
Um, so those were a couple of the incidents that, yeah, I was always thinking about crime and both sides of the law.
That's
Do
so
you
cool.
think what do you think your dad would say about your if he were alive today and could see your kind of illustrious career and all the people you've interacted with and the murderers you've delved into? Because it sounded like he wasn't really interested in the why. He was just putting bad guys away.
I think he'd be proud of me, and I think he would. I doubt whether he would read this whole book that I wrote. He was never a big reader except for sporting news and U.S.
Mhm.
News and World Report. But he would be proud of me. And like he was alive when I was spending this 20 hours with Gacy in the late 1980s. He knew about that. He knew about all the Manson chapter earlier in my adulthood. He knew about my exchange of letters with Bundy, and he knew about the beginning of my 3-year correspondence with Gacy. And I'm pretty sure that he was thinking, "What the hell are you doing,
What are you
Jeff?
doing,
Why,
right?
why, why did you do this?" But he never said, "Don't do it," and he was always
Yeah,
interested in it.
very good.
Yeah,
So correct me if I'm wrong, but you enrolled at Valparaiso in 1970, 71, right? And
70,
during that time,
71.
71. And during that time is when you really started kind of latching on to the Manson murders from the late 60s. And that was because of a book you read, correct?
Correct. I mean, I never paid any attention to news about the Manson murders when they occurred in '69. I was a sophomore in high school and interested in sports, music, and social events, basically. I didn't pay any attention to it at all. But I went to England for the fall semester my junior year, and I just picked up off one of those metal revolving book racks and you see in bus depots and train stations. And it was an English edition of the book The Family by Ed Sanders. And my buddy and I were up in the Lake District at the time, so I was looking for something to read, not necessarily the romantic poets either.
Right.
So I plucked this book off the rack and I started reading it, and I was just amazed by it. There was talk of sort of black market porn and orgies and just crazy rituals on the beach with blood and animals, and I thought, wow, this is wild. And I remember when I got to the end of it,
Wow.
it mentioned that a lot of these people who had congregated around Manson weren't in prison. And I thought, what?
Right.
I just kind of assumed that all these people would have been led like so many cattle into a maximum security prison.
Right.
And I learned that some of them were out. So that fascinated me. Then my senior year, 1974, this experience I just described was in fall of 73. Then in 74, Helter Skelter came out. And I read that in a fever, a single all night binge. I was drinking coffee, began about 3 in the afternoon and finished at about 11 or 12 the next day. But I just couldn't put it down. I was so fascinated by it. And in my abnormal psychology class one day, the professor mentioned that he had read Helter Skelter. And I thought, oh, cool. I'm going to stay after class and talk with him and trade observations about the book. And one of the things I said during that hallway conversation was, you know, you read about those people who followed Manson and you get the impression that they were these kind of one-dimensional automatons who
Robots. Yeah.
basically lost free will and,
Mhm.
were doing anything Manson told them to do. And I knew some of them came from middle class families, not unlike my own. And I said, I wonder if some of them are a little more complicated than that. And he said, yeah, I wonder that too. Have you considered writing them? And I said, writing them? Members of the Manson family? No, the thought had never crossed my mind. And he said, well, you might find it interesting.
Did any of your friends or family try to talk you out of it?
I don't really remember that I sought their opinions before I did it.
Okay.
I let the idea marinate in my brain for a little while, and then I finally decided to do it. And I wrote to Manson, and not, I just assumed my letter wouldn't get to him or he would ignore it or whatever. And he wrote back a short letter basically saying, you're a fool and you're a fraud. Don't bother me with this bullshit. Don't try to make me think you're interested in my poetry and my lyrics. If you've really got something significant to say other than this BS, write me back.
Wow.
So I
Wow.
thought, okay. And so I wrote him another letter that told him some things about myself. I told him I was senior in college. I had read a couple books about his case. I was interested in how he had been portrayed. I at least expressed an openness to the possibility that chroniclers of his case had gotten some things wrong, hoping that I could, seduce him into a conversation.
Right.
And he wrote this sort of very contemplative letter back to me, which contemplative is not Manson's default mode,
Yeah.
as I
I'll say.
as I came to know well over the next year and a half. But it was an unusual letter, and it was in that letter when he said that beast was not me, among lots of other things. Told me that I was his kid, his son, his child, his love. And he said at the end of the letter, start a garden wherever you walk. It was this kind of like almost, I don't know how to describe it. It was like, I say in my book that it was a kind of peroration. It was like this call that sounded nothing like the versions of Manson I had encountered in his books. Start a garden wherever you walk. I thought, what is that
Yeah.
about? And so it escalated my interest in him and made me more open to the possibility that there was a multidimensional person there.
Well, and one of the fascinating things to me is when you chose to reach out to all four of these people, the Squeaky Fromm, Sandra Good, Susan Atkins, and Charles. Two of them, like you said, were not in jail. So was that scary to you to get? You have to put a return address on the letter.
It was because yes, I had to put a return address on the letter. And the story, can I just tell a little? I promise I won't babble on too long
Absolutely. Oh
about
my
this.
God.
Yeah.
But about how I located Squeaky and Sandy. They were not in prison, but I had no idea where they were. None. I should have assumed that they hadn't strayed too far from Manson, and he was in Folsom Prison. But I didn't know how to reach them. And I remembered one paragraph in Helter Skelter that described an assistant district attorney in Los Angeles, the office that had prosecuted Manson and all the other Manson family members. And it said that he had befriended the girls who weren't in custody because they were holding a vigil outside the Hall of Justice in LA. And he kind of befriended them, and his wife baked them Christmas cookies. And he said something like, "There's a lot I admire in this group, their anti war attitudes and so on." And I thought, well, I wonder if he knows where they are. So, in search of Squeaky and Sandy, I sent a letter, care of him, to the LA District Attorney's office. I was
Oh, wow.
pretty resourceful, I think.
I'll say.
Wow.
I mean, I wrote the women a letter and enclosed it in an envelope. Then it enclosed it in a larger envelope with a letter to him. And I said, if you know where Squeaky and Sandy are, can you please complete the address on this envelope and send it to them? And he wrote me back right away, to my immense surprise, and said, yes, I do know where they are. And I forwarded your letter to them yesterday. He didn't tell me their address, of course. But then about a week later, I got my first letter from Squeaky Fromy, which was also, I mean, by all accounts, she was Manson's second in command. She was a dyed-in-the-wool Manson fanatic. Yet she sends me this floral accented stationery with this very loopy, sort of like, I call it
Like a heart to dot the I and stuff.
Well, there were hearts. I always say it was like a middle school girl's handwriting, but then I always think I make myself vulnerable to criticism for saying that. But that's what it looked like to me. And she talked of peace and love and nothing about the murders at all. But she invited me to write back. And not only was she interested in my address, which she obviously already had, but she wanted to know more about me, and she wanted a picture of me. And I remember thinking, and I talked with my then roommate about this, do I really want to send Squeaky Fromy a picture of myself? And he said, well, find one that doesn't look anything like you.
Oh, you were catfishing before catfishing was cool.
So that's what I did. It was me. But it was a picture that really didn't look anything like me.
Oh my gosh.
Because I had these visions of these women showing up on my doorstep. I mean, I was,
Yeah.
And after my graduation senior year, I moved back home to Western New York to where my parents lived. My dad's still in the FBI at the time. And I'm getting letters from Charles Manson, Squeaky Fromy, and Sandy Good sent to my parents' address. And that was bizarre. My parents knew about this. I was working at the post office that summer, so I was able to intercept most of them before they made it into my parents' mailbox, which is probably a federal crime in and of itself.
I think so. Yeah.
But anyway, so they wrote me at my parents' house in Western New York, and then I got a letter, and there was a sequence of increasingly alarming letters that Sandy Good, Squeaky's roommate, wrote me. And the one that first got my attention was the one that began, "Dear Jeff, we're moving out of the realm of words." I thought, what do you mean we're moving out of the realm of words? That is someplace I don't want to go.
That's a threat if I ever heard one.
I want to stay in the realm of words. and what it meant was she was seeing signs that maybe I could help them, or maybe I'd be willing to help them in some ways. But I tried to steer the conversation a different way. And then about 2 weeks later, I got the last letter I got during that period from Sandy Good. And it was truly alarming. In that letter, she talked about wanting me to, me or one of my friends could kill a hunter in the forest and then leave signs on the trees saying there are hunters hunting hunters, because they were all about the environment and, preserve the environment. She talked about people getting their arms chopped off. She wanted me to deliver that kind of message to people who she thought were harming the environment. She was giving me addresses she wanted me to write to. And she said, call these people at their homes, talk with their wives if you can. And if they say,
Wow.
and tell them Manson demands that you do this. And if they say who, tell them Manson. Remember Sharon Tate? Soon
Wow.
a wave of assassins will sweep through your homes, splashing blood from room to room. And I remember thinking,
Unreal.
okay, now I'm in way over my head. I need to extricate myself from this.
Mhm.
And I did. Again, I think I was fairly resourceful in
Oh,
figuring
you
out a way to
lied.
do that.
You had to lie to do it.
I did have to lie. I told him that I'd left where I was staying in Western New York, that I was hitchhiking all summer, and I didn't have a set address. And I had a very close undergraduate friend of mine, who you may know her name, Jackie Leiden. She was a longtime
I
NPR
don't.
correspondent.
No,
She
I
she
don't.
she co-anchored All Things Considered for years, but
Mm-hmm.
anyway, she was a close undergraduate friend, and she lived in Wisconsin. So I sent Jackie a letter to Squeaky and Sandy inside a larger envelope, asked Jackie to send it from Wisconsin to get a Wisconsin postmark.
Right.
And I
Wow.
and I said in the letter, I'd left my address, I was traveling. And that was in early July. Then on September 5th, headlines screamed across the country, Squeaky Frommie had attempted to assassinate President Ford, only like 2 months after I managed to squirm out of that correspondence. So that
Wow.
was wild.
In retrospect, I think you made the right choice because it sounds like you were being recruited.
I was being recruited. I know I made the right choice. And just the last thing I'll say about that chapter, because it's kind of classic, I think.
Mhm.
I had begun graduate school at Purdue the fall of 75. And I remember talking to my parents on the phone. My poor dad, my poor long suffering dad, says, Jeff, my boss called me in the other day and he said, Jack, I don't know how to tell you this, but we got whatever they used then, teletype or something
Yeah, they
from
did. Yep.
from Sacramento, and the FBI found a cache of letters in Squeaky's apartment from someone named Jeffrey Smalldon, and he's been
Like
using your home address.
crazy, right? I don't.
I loved that part. I laughed out loud. I was like, oh my God, his poor dad.
Yeah, really. And he, what they explained to my dad that they were mainly concerned about my welfare because Sandy wasn't in custody. Squeaky was, but Sandy wasn't. And they were afraid she was going to try to get in touch with me.
With good reason.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and during this time, you were also working towards your master's in English at Purdue, correct?
Correct.
You taught English at your alma mater, then at Valpo, and then came a total shift in gears. And so tell us about this kind of career detour and what sparked it.
Well, I mean, it's one of the things that I wanted to include that part of my story in my book because I think it's bizarre. A lot of people probably have similar experiences, but this is how mine went. I go to Ireland for a year to study modern Irish literature at Trinity College. And during that year, I loved the study of literature, but I thought, I don't really think I can find a comfortable home in academia with that publisher perish mentality. I just don't want to become a part of that. But I had no idea what I wanted to do if not that. So I remember one day when I got home after that year in Ireland, I literally said to my mother, I just have no idea what direction to take in my life. And she was a problem solver. And she said, well, have you ever thought of hospital administration? And I said, no, what's hospital administration? I'd never heard of it before. And she said, well, I don't really know either. But she was a nurse at the local hospital. She said, down at the hospital, there are two very friendly young men. I've heard them referred to as administrators. They always greet me in the hallway when I pass them. Why don't you go talk with one of them? I had nothing better to do. So I
You're
said,
like,
oh,
okay.
okay. So I called the hospital, arranged to meet with this guy. I liked him. He seemed like a nice guy, very unpretentious. And at the end of our meeting, he said he liked his job and so on. And at the end of our meeting, he said, here's what you do, Jeff. Go do your master's at George Washington University, which is where he had gone, and come back and work for me. I had no other prospects at the time. It sort of sounded like a job offer. So I did it. The next day, I applied to George Washington. It was the only school I applied to. I had to get accepted there, and I had to get pretty much what amounted to a full scholarship because I was pretty much broke after my year in Ireland. And I thought I'd never taken a business class in my life. So I thought, there's no way they're going to admit me. And if they didn't, I'd look for a different path in life, something totally
Sure.
different. Miraculously, they did admit me, and I got a very generous scholarship. They presumably perceived me as some sort of a bizarre sleeper candidate they were willing
Yeah.
to take a gamble on. So I went there, and for the second half of my degree, after the coursework was over, we had to go somewhere in the country for an administrative residency year. And I had friends who went to San Diego, San Francisco, Boston, all over the place. And I ended up in Columbus, Ohio, at what was then the largest private general hospital in Ohio. Cool. So I spent my residency year there. They asked me to stay on. I kept getting promoted, I think just because I got along with people and I was a nice guy, I guess. And then December 30th of 1983, in one of the departments I had administrative responsibility for, it was a very small research lab, two of the 6 employees there were murdered between 4:30 and 5 on a Friday afternoon, right around the corner from the hospital's main corridor. I was home at my parents' house in New York for the Christmas holidays, and the director of public relations called me and said, Jeff, we've had a horrible tragedy. Joyce and Patty were murdered on Friday afternoon in the lab. And I said, what? I mean, it was so bizarre, like the last thing I ever could have imagined.
Sure.
So I returned to Columbus, tried to go back to work. I thought I knew who had probably committed the murders, and I was sitting across from him every day in my office.
Wow.
And he would weep
Wow.
about the 2 women who were murdered. And I'm sitting there thinking, okay, but I think you probably did it. Obviously, I didn't say that. But I mean, work there became very difficult for me. And I finally decided this was an experiment that I'm glad I embarked on, but hospital administration / business was never going to be the right niche for me. So I decided to become a forensic psychologist, and I began work toward my PhD at Ohio State, then opened my private practice and had the career that I had. But, looking back on that, I think hospital administration, I never would have thought of that. One school I applied to, if they would have rejected my application, I'd have gone a completely different direction altogether. I happen to end up at this hospital in Columbus, and 2 of my employees in my department are murdered. And I thought, what is going on here? The Manson stuff had all taken place almost a decade before. And then there's this double homicide at the hospital. And I thought, murder seems to be a recurring theme in my life. Maybe I should make it the theme of my adult life.
It's crazy the tie-in because these women weren't just murdered. I mean, we're talking dozens of stab wounds, throat slit. One was hogtied, correct? And just for our listeners,
Right.
he's referring to Joyce McFadden and Patty Maddox. If anyone wants to Google it and look it up, but I mean, this had Manson-esque vibes too, which is crazy.
It did, and the way that story turns out, nobody knew who had committed these murders. Nobody really had any idea, except I guess everyone had their idea of who might have, but police didn't identify any suspects. And part of what was stumping everyone was what you just described, Ed. These were incredibly brutal murders. They weren't like, an execution style uh, gunshot with a silencer out in the parking lot or anything. One of them, as you said, was hogtied. Another one was put in a freezer that was ordinarily used to store tissue samples. And, everybody thought this is so bizarre. Nobody knew of either of these women having any enemies. And then I guess it was 2.5 years later, after I had begun graduate school at Ohio State, I pick up the paper from my porch one morning and I see the headline saying worst shootout in FBI history in Miami. 2 agents killed, 4 wounded, 2 suspects killed, and they had a big picture of the intersection where this big shootout occurred. And I start reading down the column, and it says the 2 suspects killed in the shootout, who were suspected in a series of brazen daytime bank robberies and at least one murder, are Michael J. Platt and William Maddox, formerly of Columbus, Ohio, whose wife died
Wow.
under mysterious circumstances 2.5 years ago. And I thought, Bill Maddox? Like, I remember at the memorial service for the women at the hospital, shaking his hand, offering my condolences. They were known to be very conservative Baptist people.
Wow.
And so after the murders, he met an old army buddy of his. They went to, and another element of that case that just makes it all that more tragic and bizarre is that at the time of Patty's murder, she and Bill had a 4-month-old daughter.
Oh.
Wow. I didn't know
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, 4-month-old daughter at the time of Patty's murder. So Bill took the baby along with his old army buddy, moved to Florida, started a landscaping business, and then got involved in this spate of crimes that ended in the shootout. But it was another one of those times in my life where, sort of like Peter Magaddino at the Como, it's like someone who seemed to have such a well curated public persona, yet turned out to be someone very different.
Well, and it's probably safe to say that that incident is what kind of sparked you to start to figure out get in the minds of killers. Why do they do what they do?
Yes. Yes. I mean, it altered the trajectory of my life. That was in December of 1983. And it totally altered the trajectory of my life, everything that came after that.
Great. Well, I want to shift gears for a second and talk about Ted Bundy, only because we covered him a couple weeks ago before our interview with Edna, just to set people up in case they don't know. I mean, I don't know anyone who doesn't know the story by now, but it leads into a guest really nicely. So walk us through your brief interaction with Ted Bundy. Was it an attempt at all to try to figure out who killed Patty and Joyce?
It was. I knew in 1984, yeah, 1984, before I began graduate school at Ohio State, I'd read a number of books about the Bundy case, including one called The Only Living Witness, where one of the co-authors, Stephen Michaud, had met many times with Bundy and had offered Bundy the opportunity to talk about his crimes in the third person. So without incriminating himself, Bundy could say, I think the person who committed this crime would have done this, would have been thinking that. So I knew that Bundy had participated in such an exercise once before. And I also knew that Bundy was known for sometimes seeming to disappear into thin air after the murders he committed. People just couldn't believe it. They saw this woman one minute, she was walking around the corner, and then she was gone. Nobody heard or saw anything, and whoever killed her was gone. So I thought, Bundy's on death row in Florida, but denying any culpability for any of these murders. But I figured this is a guy who knows something about murder and knows about how to disappear after committing one. So I wrote him a letter in 1984, and he would have known from writing my letter that I knew a lot about his case. I asked a lot of very specific questions, and I said I was interested in having a dialogue. And I figured if I could coax him into a dialogue, a discussion of the Riverside murders could come later. We could get to that if I managed to develop some rapport with him. And I told him at the end of the letter, I said, I'm not trying to bother you. If you don't respond to this letter, you'll never hear from me again. And I didn't hear from him. So I just thought, well, that's that. Bundy's not going to respond. And then a little over a year later, I reach into my mailbox and get a letter with Ted Bundy's handwritten return address on it. And in the envelope was uh, it was like a harvest picture on it, but it was kind of like a holiday card. It was an image of abundance on the card, and inside Bundy wished me and mine peace and blessings in the new year. But the classic was, and before I get to the actual text of the letter, which was pretty short, Bundy's signature characteristic, and you touched on this in your interview with Edna Cowell Martin, but was the incredible distances that he would travel in search of victims. She talked about being in Seattle, but he went to Utah and Colorado and then ended up in Florida. So the FBI called him a rover. He was very mobile. And I knew that, and he would have known I knew that from the letter that I wrote him. And so he says in the letter he writes me, sounding more like a snooty professor than a infamous serial killer, he starts out by saying, "Dear Jeffrey, you wrote me more than a year ago. I've kept your letter all this time amongst," he used that word, "amongst my papers."
Oh.
Yeah, sounding like a professor. And then he says, "I
Yeah.
apologize that it's taken me such an inordinately long time to respond to your letter." And he says, "As far as your questions, all I can say is I thought they were particularly searching and thoughtful." And then he says, "You asked how I'm doing. All I can say is that here's a guy sitting on death row for a brutal attack on a number of women in the Chi Omega sorority at Florida State, and the sexual assault and murder of a 12-year-old girl. He's got those two separate death sentences. And he says, all I can tell you is that I've never felt better in my life, spiritually, mentally, and physically. I hope the same can be said for you." And then here's the great part. The sign off to his letter. He says, "Take care, watch yourself, travel light. Peace, Ted." And I thought, that's just the classic serial killer's tease, trying to be the clever guy who I'm not going to admit these crimes to you, but I committed them. I know I
but
committed
wink,
them.
wink.
Wink,
Yeah.
exactly. Wink, wink,
Yeah.
wink. Aren't I clever? And I say in my book, there's a part of me that felt mildly flattered because he identified me as someone who would get the joke. And I did. So I've always
Wow.
thought that was sort of a classic, even though it was a brief exchange.
So we want to get into Gacy, but we want to dig a little bit more. And I want to start our convo on Gacy by reading a quote from your book, which is actually a quote from Alec Wilkinson, a journalist who interviewed Gacy as part of that multi-part interview that he agreed to before his execution. And Alec said in the New Yorker, quote, "Visiting Gacy is like spending time with someone who is pretending to like you, to separate you violently, if necessary, from something you possess," end quote. And then you follow that up with a short but very poignant sentence, "like your life."
Mhm.
And in my
I got
opinion,
goosebumps when I
right,
read that.
because we had just spent so much time, everyone knows the story, but we re-researched this for our episode, and it was like, to listen to the things that he was responsible for, that's a perfect characterization, in my opinion, of Gacy.
Well, I thought the Wilkinson's article in the New Yorker was fantastic. I mean, he described the Gacy I came to know, and there are any number of observations in that article. The first sentence of the article was, "John Gacy is obsessively fond of defending his innocence, which is imaginary. That's the statement that the article began with. But I think the quote that you mentioned, Ed, is a really good one. He also said he talked about Gacy's personality having collapsed years before and been replaced by a catalog of gestures and attitudes that he could use to sort of mimic a normal person. Again, as we've noted a couple of times during this conversation, the carefully curated public personas that these people tend to be so good at. I've often said, if only they all looked like Charles Manson, it would be so much easier. We would all know to turn and run, but they don't.
Yeah.
Most of them don't. I mean, the time I spent with Gacy was, even though it was almost 40 years ago now, but it's so vivid in my mind. I spent about 20 hours with him across 4 days.
Yeah, before you get to that, you had, Melissa, you were talking about you wanted to get into some of the letters. Before we get into you meeting Gacy, you had pen pal relationship with him.
For quite a while before you actually met in person. Can you tell us what the letters entailed? Any of our listeners haven't read your book yet, but it was a lot of Gacy talking about himself, right?
Right. I mean, he was sort of astonishingly egocentric in a way it's hard for people to imagine unless they've been in the presence of a true narcissist like Gacy, where everything had to do with him. He would I say in my book that we'd be talking and he'd be just babbling on about all the reasons he shouldn't have been found guilty of these murders. And like Wilkinson says in that article that at times Gacy's company was so dreary that Wilkinson would take his watch off, so he didn't have to look at the face and tick off the minutes they were going by so slowly. And that was my experience too. But I mean, Gacy, in his letters, I learned quickly how prickly he could become, how quickly.
But it sounds like over the same things. Like he'll ask you a question, you'll answer it, and then he'll be like, that's not what I asked you. I didn't say that. Or like he would twist anything.
Always he had some objection. He would ask me a question, I would answer it, and then he would say, well, there you go again, Jeff. You're into the fantasy and the hypothetical and the speculation. Come on, you're smarter than that. until the next exchange like that.
Yeah, ridiculous.
He's very, very thin-skinned. In fact, after our first exchange of letters, he was ready to bail out of the correspondence. He said, I feel like, you want to make this an interrogation rather than a pen pal type situation. Maybe we should end it right here. But then he ended that letter saying, write me back if you want. And I did. And, that was smoothed over. And we ended up, as I said, corresponding for 3 years.
I feel like when he did that was some sort of game, like maybe we should stop this. Write me back if you want to. Almost like
it's like playing hard to get.
Boyfriend, girlfriend.
Yeah.
Yes, like a playing hard to get thing.
And I also think part of his need for control, to at least posture as though he had control of what was going to happen. I could write him back, but he might decide to bail out anyway.
Well, and one of the things that Gacy asked you, and I don't recall if this was in the letters or in person, but why normal people were so fascinated with killing and killers in the first place. And that seemed to be kind of a theme with him, right? That he considered himself a normal guy, just like you. He's like, I'm just like you, Jeff. I don't know. We're normal guys, just two dudes hanging out, right?
That's what he would say. Yeah. Why do people have to make me into this monster? I'm just a man. I'm just like you. And he would even say, well, I drew him into a discussion of psychopathy at one point because I had written a paper for one of my graduate school classes. And I thought, well, I'm interested in what Gacy would have to say on the subject of psychopathy. And he was delighted. He
Right.
was pretty much delighted for the opportunity to weigh in on any topic because he
Sure.
thought he was an expert, including on the mind of the serial killer, never seeming to appreciate the irony of him declaring he knew anything about it from
Yeah.
firsthand experience. But
Yeah.
he thought nothing of pontificating about that. Um, but yeah, I mean, he would always posture as though he was the one in control and he could determine the direction things were going to go.
Man. So how did you get then from being pen pals to making the decision to go visit him? Was December 15th, 1986?
He invited me. He said, I'd be love to have you visit sometime, and be sure when you check in, don't whatever you do, don't identify yourself as a psychologist or a journalist because they won't let you in. Tell them you're my friend, and they'll let you in to see me. So, yeah, I mean, I drove 450 miles from Columbus, where I
Wow.
lived, to southwestern Illinois, where Menard Correctional Institution was. And I mean, it was totally new for me. I was so green. Looking back at it now, I just think, wow, what were you doing?
Was your
Um,
stomach in knots? That had to be the longest 450 miles ever.
yeah, I mean, I was definitely nervous. And I mean, the one describe in my book, I go through all these checkpoints, and later on, I came to know the routine and maximum security prisons pretty well, but I didn't back then. And so I was struck by this endless succession of gates and locked doors and waiting rooms, and then there was a walk outside to the building where death row was. And yeah, I was nervous. I didn't say much to the guard who was acting as my escort. And we get up to the second floor in the building where death row is. And we're at an iron gate. And all of a sudden he stops. He's about to put his key in the gate. And he says, well, I know you've come a long way to get here. Presumably, you know why Mr. Gacy is on our condemned unit. That's what he called it, not death row, our condemned unit. And I just want to remind you that when you go through this gate, you're going to be on your own. It's against prison policy to negotiate with inmates. So, should things go awry back there, or God forbid, if a hostage situation should develop, you're on your own. Do you understand? And I remember like sort of my heart going into my throat. And I said, yeah, I mean, what else was I going to say? I'd driven
Yeah.
450 miles. I wasn't going to bail out at that point. But yeah, my stomach was in knots. And then,
Well, before you
sorry,
move on, I gave the book to my mom after I told her what we were doing because we've had the book now for a while. So we finished it and I gave it to her, and she's like, "Can I ask him a question?" I said, "Absolutely." So it
good.
was about that. It was about that because she said, if you would have known that you weren't as secure as you thought you were going to be going into that encounter, in hindsight, would you have done it?
It's a good question. And I'm not sure I know the answer. It would have gotten my attention. I don't think at that point it would have stopped me because I mean, I think I had that sort of, novice's feeling of invulnerability that, like,
You don't
I
know
don't
what you
know.
don't know.
You don't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
And I would have thought that, there would at least be a video camera, some guard nearby who was monitoring what was going on in there. So I think I would have gone anyway, sort of rushed
Okay.
headlong into a situation where I was vulnerable as could be.
He obviously had an agenda for why he wanted to talk to you, and what his agenda was. I don't know if we'll ever know, but you obviously had one too. So what were you hoping to gain or learn by meeting with him? You could have just stayed pen pals.
One thing I think he wanted was another image to masturbate to. frankly.
That's mhm.
I mean, he told me at one
Yeah.
point, you looked younger than I thought you would be, which meant I
Oh,
was dropping down in the upper part of his
Mhm.
age
His
cohort.
range. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean,
yes.
I very much think that he saw me in that way, particularly when he got a picture of the two of us to take back to his cell.
The
But
Polaroid.
the Polaroid, yeah, I mean,
Yes.
I knew what he was going to use that for, but what was I going to say? You can't use it. You can't use it that way.
Right.
It
Yeah,
just,
right?
but I knew. So what did I want? I mean, in the most naive way possible, I wanted to see what he was like. I'd read these books about him, and I thought, yeah, this guy is an out of control maniac. One this well known forensic psychiatrist who testified at his trial, famously or infamously, during her testimony, was asked, "So, do you believe if a policeman had been in the same room when Gacy was with his last victim, Rob Peast, do you believe Gacy would have killed him anyway with a policeman there?" And she said, "Yes, I do. I believe he was that out of control." So, I had in mind this guy, not just with serious impulse control problems, but who sounded like a maniac. And I was interested enough that my interest overcame my sense of vulnerability, I think. I wanted to see how he would present himself. I also wanted to sample the extreme narcissism that I knew from the reading I'd done was at the center of his personality. I figured he would deny the murders, but I was interested in how he would do it, particularly when I began nipping at around the edges of his denials.
His comfort zone. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was frustrated for the most part. I got him to talk about five of the murders, but he would say, that punk came and worked for me for a while. His mother asked me to help get him off drugs, and then he just disappeared one day. And I said, "Well, didn't they find him in your crawl space?" And he said, "I can't get into that. My
Yeah,
attorneys
that's
have
the
told
one
me."
thing he wouldn't talk about. Well,
My,
and it blew my mind to know that his first response was to bash those victims
oh,
rather than,
absolutely.
I don't know anything.
Oh, yeah,
Hmm.
absolutely. The one who survived a long night of torture at his house and then testified at his trial, Jeffrey Rignall. When I brought Rignall's name up, he said, "Yeah, that punk took the stand. He even vomited on the stand.
Yeah,
He was a punk. The police knew he was a punk. Like, just totally trashed him."
it's
This
very much like his dad would talk to him.
probably echoes of that, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One.
So, one of the big things we noticed, because we talked about Bundy and then we talked about Gacy, and we kind of noticed that the two of them had very similar characteristics, but yet are so different. Like, they're both into politics. Granted, Bundy was a Republican, Gacy a Democrat. They both were super narcissistic. They both lured people with their charisma, but Bundy was very handsome, whereas Gacy was not. But why do you think they were both so successful at what they did?
Yeah, it was like they both used the same technique, this charm, but
Yeah, but so different.
apples and oranges.
Yeah, totally different personality styles, but they were both psychopaths, and they, were very good at it. I mean, people like them who managed to commit as many murders as they committed over a period of time are very skilled. They're very well camouflaged and very skilled at this kind of, as Alec Wilkinson put it, this catalog of gestures and attitudes meant to mimic normal people. I think they were both hyper observant of other people, and that made them able to not just mimic some of the normal aspects of other people's personality pretty well, but also to identify other people's vulnerabilities and choose kind of the avenue of access where these people would be most vulnerable.
Hmm. And it's wild. And you may have heard it at the end of Edna's interview, but we started ending our show with this little catchphrase that Melissa told me when we first met. And I was like, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. She said, perverts don't wear signs that say they're perverts. It was advice that her aunt gave her when
No,
she was it your
my college friend's mother used to tell us that before we used to go out.
and it was like, well, no kidding. But then I never knew how it became like our little mantra, because the more cases we cover, that's exactly right. And you touched on it. People hide in plain sight. These were normal guys that you would never, ever, ever suspect would be responsible for something so heinous.
Absolutely. That's true. And the fact that they're able to pull that off is a big part of the thrill for them. The hiding in plain sight, operating right at the margins where law enforcement begin. I mean, that's a special thrill for them. I always think of, the serial killer Ed Kemper driving through the security gates at the college where his mother worked with corpses in his trunk. And I mean, Gacy took incredible chances at times. So did Bundy, and so did Thomas Lee Dillon. And that's part of the thrill for them. I think over time they tend to get reckless because it takes more for them to find that adrenaline high that they get from hiding in plain sight.
Why on earth, then, if they were so cautious, why did Ted Bundy use his own name? And I don't want to get away from Gacy, but I need to know your take on this. So he went around going, "My name's Ted. How you doing?"
No, I think that's a great question. I wish I had an answer for it. I listened to your interview with Edna Martin, and you asked her that same question, and she said, "Yeah, it's a mystery to me too." It's always been a mystery. And when I've read about Bundy, like particularly that double homicide at Lake Sammamish, like,
Yes.
I mean, you approach these women, identify yourself as Ted, allow yourself to be seen in a tan Volkswagen. But the only way I know to account for that is that was incredibly exciting for him to identify himself by his real name and still get away with it. And he
Wow.
probably loved it when Edna, his cousin, approached him and said, what is going on? These murders are being reported in the
Oh,
paper,
and she's
attributed
got a
to someone named
picture. Here's a
Ted,
picture of the
and
guy.
it's a
Yeah.
Volkswagen. And Bundy
And
says,
Yeah.
he's like,
"Yeah, yeah, isn't I
weird.
mean, it's bizarre, isn't it?" Yeah, I mean
Crazy.
that's the best explanation I can get, but that's always been a mystery and a
Yeah.
fascinating part of the Bundy case for me as well.
So I have to know, do you still have the cigar that Gacy gave
I
you?
do. I do.
Wow.
Oh, my goodness.
Fortunately, it's wrapped in cellophane still. But yeah, I mean, I thought I had to open my Gacy chapter with that little anecdote where he was sort of
Absolutely.
begging me to smoke this cigar in his presence. And I said, no, I think I'll wait until I get home for that one.
We won't make you elaborate on what he was implying.
I knew what he was implying.
But yeah. Oh, let's talk about his paintings real quick, or maybe tell us about them. I mean, the ones you purchased and then the one that you were gifted. That's so wild.
I was gifted one and I bought two. The two I bought were for $30 each. And one day I wandered into one of these murderabilia sites online because I was interested in the culture of that site. But also I wanted to test the market, not because I wanted to sell the paintings, but I thought, how much will people pay for these things?
A lot.
And like at the end of the first day, I posted pictures of the paintings I had. Like I could have made $8,000, even though I paid a total of 60. So yeah, and I thought back to what Gacy at the time said to me, Jeff, you really ought to purchase some of these paintings. Their value is just going to go up and up. If I were you, I'd buy some of this clown sequence. It's probably going to be my most famous one. And then he'd say, Picasso had his style, I have mine. I mean, just extraordinary grandiosity. But anyway, the two of those three paintings that I talk about most frequently are, he did his version of the famous Picasso line. I don't know what it was originally made with, but it was a drawing of Don Quixote on his steed. And Gacy's was a knockoff, but he did a pretty good job of it, I thought, copying it. And he called his The Quest, and he put my initials on Don Quixote's shield, JS, because he said he saw me as a quester after the truth. And I remember when he told me that, I thought, what does that mean, to be called a quester after the truth by one of the 20th century's most prolific liars? So that was one of them. The other one, and I think this is a very telling anecdote, Gacy would bring a couple paintings out to our meetings, and he would lean them on the wall. He'd set them on the table where we were meeting and then lean them on the wall. And he would say, no pressure to buy these, Jeff. I'm showing you a couple of these because I want to remind you that my sale of paintings is what allows me to send letters and buy postage stamps. So making me think like by purchasing one of these, I would be supporting him as my correspondent. And we were sitting that day, and I was kind of bugging him about the victims that he said he knew something about, trying to draw him out on those. And he says, Jeff, he positioned his hands like, you'd fan out a deck of cards. And he says, I've got a picture back in my cell of every one of those kids who they say I killed. And you know what? Those kids are no more real to me than, and he paused, like he wasn't sure how to finish the sentence. And leaning against the wall was a painting he had done of the 7 dwarfs in Snow White. And he finally pointed out, and he said, they're no more real to me than those cartoon characters in that painting. And I remember thinking, that is probably the first true thing he said all day, that his victims really did have no more reality to him than these cartoon characters.
That 7 Dwarfs painting, the one thing that I thought was really interesting was that there was a little shovel in the corner of the painting.
Yes.
That wasn't necessary, you
No.
know?
No, that really stuck out to me too. This is a painting of the 7 dwarfs and the mine. They're at the door to the mine. And Gacy's guy who had 26 bodies in the crawl space under his house, 4 more buried elsewhere on his body. Then he started throwing them in the Des Plaines River. But yeah, on the bottom left-hand corner of the painting of these dwarfs at the mouth of the mine is this shovel. And I knew by that time I couldn't bring it up to him. I couldn't say, John, what's the deal with that shovel?
Yeah. What are you saying, Jeff? What are you saying?
Yeah, exactly. He would say,
Yeah.
he would have been outraged because I had tried that earlier. I described the incident in my report where he wanted me to solve these puzzles, and one of them, the solution was 6 feet under. And I said, that one made me kind of uncomfortable, John, given the facts of your case. And he acted outraged that I would have even implied a connection with his case. How could you say such a thing? So, but because of that experience, I knew that there was no use mentioning the shovel, or he would have had a tantrum.
Well, eventually in February of 89, I guess you decided to end your correspondence with Gacy. What precipitated that decision? Because, just from hearing you talk about it and reading the book, I imagine it was a pretty exhausting relationship.
Yeah, exhausting is a good word for it. And by the time I ended it, my wife and I had moved to Connecticut. I was doing my 1-year pre-doctoral internship at a state psychiatric hospital there and writing my 500-page dissertation, getting up at 4 every morning for 5 hours before going to work. So I had a lot going on, and yeah, I was just exhausted. I just thought I can't do this anymore. And so, we didn't agree to end the correspondence. It sort of ended with a whimper rather than a bang. I just didn't respond to one of his letters at one point, and
that was
that's
it.
kind of it. Yeah.
Well, before we move on, I want to make sure we touch on Dillon, because that was a catalyst to a different stage of your career. So let's hit on that too.
Yeah, for people unfamiliar with the case, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, there were these bizarre, seemingly inexplicable killings in counties in eastern Ohio, rural counties in eastern Ohio. And whoever was committing them, the only one that stood out from the other four was the first one, where the killer shot a jogger on the side of the road. But the other ones were murders with a high-powered rifle at a distance of like 300 feet, no shell casings left around, no indication at all that the killer had interacted with the victim at all. And 5 different counties. And eventually the FBI and the police determined that it had to be a serial killer. And that conclusion was verified when the local newspaper in one of the small towns where one of the victims had lived with his family received a letter, anonymous letter to the editor saying, "I am the killer of Jamie Paxton, the victim in that county." And he went on to say, when you think about this, it's unbelievable. Whoever wrote this letter knew that there was a grieving family who would read that newspaper. And he said, "Killing Jamie Paxton meant no more to me than shooting a bottle at the dump." I mean, the callousness is just extraordinary. But he goes on to reveal details about that murder that no one other than the killer could have known. And then, adopting a patronizing tone, he says to the sheriff in that county, "Don't feel bad because you haven't been able to identify me or capture me. How could you? I never knew any of these victims, no interaction with them at all. So you would have no way of linking me to any of these victims." So he was just delighting in needling law enforcement and saying, that patronizing part, "Don't feel bad just because you haven't captured me. How could you?" So Dillon, they knew that whoever wrote that letter was the killer. And eventually, I won't go into it, but Dillon made a couple critical mistakes that led police to arrest him. And he was charged with 5 counts of aggravated murder for these 5 shootings in 5 different counties. And he ended up wanting to spare himself the death penalty, which he almost surely would have gotten had he gone to trial. He pled guilty to 5 counts of aggravated murder. And then later, just one little interesting wrinkle about Dillon, he and I stayed in touch. He would write me occasionally from prison, and he urged me to come and see him, which I didn't do. I always intended to, and I just couldn't figure out the time to do it. But he said, "There are things I never told the FBI, never told the police. There's a lot they don't know about things from the early years." And he used capitals for the 3 letters. So I don't know whether that was just a tantalizing game he was playing, or if there really were crimes other than the ones he pled guilty to, murders.
That's the thing. You never know what the motivation is behind these things because of who you're working with. Yeah.
I mean, it's hard to believe for normal people that you claim to have committed murders that you didn't. Um, but some of them do that as a tease. I mean, Dillon would have found himself in trouble, I think, because part of his plea agreement was that he tell the whole story. And if after he was sentenced to prison, he revealed things he didn't reveal to the police, I'm not sure of the legalities of it, but I think he might have been vulnerable to the death penalty again.
Wow. There's just so much that we would like to just spend 4 hours talking to you about stuff. And I wish we had more time because one, I don't want to spoil your book too by giving away too much. It's such an incredible book. But in your career, you have consulted on nearly 300 capital murder cases and spoken to, what is it, more than 1,000 murderers. That's absolutely incredible. And I'm curious to know if that's what the graduate student signed up for when he wanted to know what makes murderers tick.
Well, kind of. I mean, I was always interested in violent crime, and so I knew death penalty work would be kind of a natural fit for me. Those were the worst of the worst. The ones that
Mhm.
the state wanted to kill. A lot of them very high profile cases involving multiple victims. So yeah, I always knew I wanted death penalty case consultation to be a central part of my practice. And it was. I mean, I look back, I was very fortunate. I ended up having pretty much the practice I dreamed of having when I began graduate school. So it
Wow.
worked out well for me.
What would your advice and opinion be about me writing to Gary Ridgway? I am very fascinated by him and his cases, and that he used a picture of his son to make people feel better about getting in the car with him. Like, that's just so manipulative. And I'm just dying to know, like, what is happening in that obviously screwed up brain of his.
Yeah, I mean, that is obviously a fascinating case. I don't know. Have you read Defending Gary, the book that his attorneys wrote?
No.
I
I,
haven't
I, I,
read
I would really recommend that. It's a big, thick book, but it's very interesting. And I don't know, any of the interviews I've ever seen with Ridgway, I can't diagnose him from afar, but whenever I see them, I think something is seriously wrong with this guy, other than the
Mm-hmm.
fact that he kills all these people. I mean, he looks autistic or somewhere on the
Yeah.
autistic spectrum. There's just something off about him, just his manner of responding to questions. When they ask him, is obviously baiting him. One of the law enforcement officers says, well, Gary, on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate yourself as a serial killer, with 10 being the best and 1 being the worst? And he maintains a completely straight face and he says, well, I'd have to say a 10.
it.
It's just such a wooden, bizarre way of responding
Yeah.
to that question. So I mean, I wouldn't discourage you, Melissa. I think he would be a fascinating guy to try and engage. He was Dennis Rader, Dillon,
Oh,
Bundy, Gacy, these well curated public personas that work for them until they no longer work. But, Ridgway, the woman to whom he was married when he was eventually arrested, spoke very lovingly of him. The time they would spend
yeah.
outdoor, the camping trips and family outings and so on. And he was hardworking, steady employment, and kind of a nice guy, low key, soft spoken most of the
Mm-hmm.
time. So I mean, I think there'd be a lot of interesting things to explore if you could ever coax him into a conversation.
What? I'm gonna do it, and I'm gonna give Ed's address as my return address.
Put it in a bag, in a box, in a bag, and send it from Wisconsin. That's all I'm saying.
Yes.
Well, Dr. Smalldon, where can people find this incredible book?
Well, it's available on Amazon, from Barnes and Noble, from the publisher Black Lion Publishing. So it's easy to obtain.
Awesome. Well, sir, we cannot thank you enough, seriously, for being on with us today. You were awesome. And I was just from
Thank
corresponding
you.
with you over email. I was so excited to just actually have this get to this moment. So thank you for being here.
Thank you very much for having me. I've enjoyed talking
Sure.
with both of you. And yeah, Ed, I kind of came to regard you as a friendly pen pal from our email
Great.
exchanges.
We can start writing. I mean, if you want, I don't.
Well,
um,
thank you very much for inviting me on as a guest. I appreciate it.
you're very welcome. And we'll do similar what we did with Edna. We'll promote the book as best as we can. Again, thank you so much. And we will talk very soon. Okay.
All right. Thank you both.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Jeff. Yeah.
Oh my goodness, that was amazing. He's amazing. And the fact that okay, hold on. He just like literally sat in a room with John Wayne Gacy. Like, probably could have reached out and touched him if, he wanted to lose his fingers,
And
catch
it's
some disease.
we hear these stories. We've been reading these stories for years and years and years. So to talk to people who actually experienced these people and saw their personalities in real time and got to smell them and to be near them and to see their facial features. You know what I'm getting at? Like, I'm not being weird,
Yes.
but you know what I'm saying? Like, they're up close and
No,
personal to the
100%.
to the headlines, which is so cool. And he is clearly a resident expert. I mean, he knows so much about a lot of people that we discuss. So very cool.
Speaking of smelling John Wayne Gacy, it took everything in me not to be like, so did he smell like foul chicken? Because I feel like he does.
He smelled like cheap
It's
cologne.
just still in his pores.
Yes.
Yeah, you're right. He smelled like cheap cologne. I
Yeah.
believe that.
Wow. Well, that
Well,
was
that
cool.
brings us to the end of our serial killer block. I gotta be honest, I am more than happy to say bye bye to Gacy
I'm
because he
exhausted.
was rough.
It's like
Yeah.
we these murders are so when we talk about them, I mean, it hits you because you're researching it, you're getting immersed in the story, but then serial killers just have so many victims. So like it's a never ending parade of just sadness and names and people's faces. So I'm glad too.
Well, I'll tell you what, for next month, we will talk about some fairy tales that end up horribly wrong. What happens when you find Prince Charming and he turns out to be a massive toad? So if you can please spare a minute to give us a like, subscribe, rate, any or all of the above would be wonderful. If you have anything to say about this last block and what you think about Gacy or Ted or Edna or Dr. Smalldon, because they're all amazing. Well, they're amazing, not Gacy and Bundy.
Not them.
But
Not them.
let us know. You can hit us up on our socials at Murder Unscripted. We're on Facebook, Insta, and TikTok. You can even email us at murderunscriptedpod@gmail.com. So until next week, just remember, don't be friends with serial killers. And perverts don't wear signs that say they're perverts.
And if anybody thinks that's a stupid statement, just listen to the last 2 weeks that we interviewed people. I think they would agree. Perverts don't wear signs that say they're pervert.
Valid advice. Bye.